Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions, and today's review will be about The Miserable Mill, a series of unfortunate events by Lemony Snicket. We're on book 4. Okay, so I was actually reading The Obelisk Gate, and I'm about 90 pages from the end, and I could have just soldiered on through the rest of this book, and the truth is I was just enjoying it too much to force myself to the end. I want to finish it more slowly and let myself linger in the story a bit more. Like, it takes a moment of stepping back and letting it, absorb. And also, frankly, I wanted to wait until I was in a slightly better mood for a not too cheerful book. So I picked up a series of unfortunate events instead. And no, really, this does make sense, I promise. Because while this series is very playfully sincere about how dark and gloomy it is, it sort of isn't. In its very insistence that the Baudelaire's lives are so much worse than anyone else's, it so reassures us that most people have better lives than this. So if there's anyone out there who just doesn't know this series, the premise is the Baudelaire children are orphans. There is Sunny, Klaus, and Violet. Their parents died in a mysterious fire, and ever since they've passed from one guardian to the next. Because every time they find a new home, the evil Count Olaf shows up to steal the fortune they stand to inherit once they come of age. This book brings the Baudelaires to a lumber mill, where the owner agrees to house and nominally feed them, and to try to keep Olaf away, in exchange for which 3 orphans will be required to work in the lumber mill. And it's sort of a silly premise when you describe it like that, right? Like, in this somewhat modern world that is not unlike ours, a baby, a 10-year-old, and a 14-year-old are being asked to work full-time in an incredibly dangerous workplace, and nobody says anything about it. They're just sort of like, okay, that sounds logical. And I think that's part of the reason that this is the first of the books for me that actually sort of is really depressing. I remember when I first read this book, I was sitting in a store waiting for my mom to come pick me up. And there was something about the book that it just made me feel helpless and hopeless. And it really made me seriously melancholy. I think that part of that is that in the first 3 books, we get the impression that most people in this world are kind and loving. And it's just that the Baudelaires are being targeted by the bad people. And therefore they keep running into the bad people, but the bulk of people are still good people. But this is the first one where we see people outside of Olaf and his troupe not just being inept or unwilling to help, but being actively bad. There are a couple people in this book that are not technically part of Olaf's troupe, but they're just not good. Sir is almost as much of a villain as Olaf, and the kids just have to accept him because he's slightly better than Olaf. Now, there are still good people in this book. If anything, there are good people who are slightly less annoyingly unhelpful as Aunt Josephine, but it's almost more depressing in that they want to help, but can't. Like, Phil is almost as much of a victim as the kids are, and then there's Charles, who, like many of the adult characters in these books, should have the power to do something, should be able to help, and just doesn't believe he has that power. He can't do anything because it will make Sir mad, even though he is ostensibly Sir's partner and therefore should have power. Sir just walks all over him and he accepts that because that's the way it is. And what is so damn depressing in this book is that the kids never bother to try to convince him he has power, the way they have with so many other characters. And it reads so clearly as they've just accepted that they will not be able to convince someone who thinks themselves powerless that they might actually be able to do something. And that's an interesting point in that we're finally getting towards the pivotal point in this series where the Baudelaires realize that they can't rely on adults at all. We start the series with them assuming their guardians will, guard them, protect them, raise them. But slowly they stop expecting that, until they finally realize they have to be their own guardians. And one could argue that this is really just the journey of growing up, but it is, of course, taken to a slightly depressing extreme in this series, because that's what kids' books tend to do, but also that is the gimmick of this series. And, like, I shouldn't talk about this now because, you know, I still have 9 books left to reread, but the ending of this series is a bit cheerful in that the kids are together, relatively stable and safe, but they get there by completely abandoning any trust or reliance on others. And this is the book that we really start them down that journey. And I sort of hate that. But that being said, there's still a lot of fun to be had in this book. Lots of wonderfully silly, over-the-top imagery. The idea of the kids staring out a window so distracted that for a moment they forgot the window is literally just drawn on a blank wall. It's fabulous. A baby sword fighting with her teeth and a severe misunderstanding of how gum works. It's the perfectly ridiculous kind of climactic action. And I laughed out loud at the gag with the table of contents. But I'm really happy that the next book is the one that introduces the Quagmire triplets, because this series at this point really desperately needs other characters who are capable, intelligent, and good, to remind us that the world isn't entirely populated with idiots, pushovers, and villains. Also, this book does have a surprisingly violent moment that I felt like came from much later on in the series. Like, the series does get pretty violent, but it's never, by the way, gruesomely described. That's not what the series is doing. You don't get much description of the violent moments, but I feel like most of the violent moments happen in the latter half of the series, and the ones that happen early on are all off page and you don't see any of it. And just in general, I feel like this book has the tone of one of the much later books in the series, where things just feel heavier and more dire. I also do want to mention that I was struck by how much this book in particular felt like an indictment of capitalism. Like the evil boss taking advantage of his helpless workers, the facelessness of the corporate entity, the good people rendered helpless by the idea that the company and profit is much more powerful than they are, how intensely boring the work is, the payment in the form of coupons, which on their own are useless, the unspoken implication that the kids could be far more useful for their individual talents than as reduced to unthinking cogs in the machine, but they are not allowed to do that. Even just the idea that a job is a trade of safety and the necessities for life in exchange for any joy, happiness, or a feeling of fulfillment, all of this feels like, you know, anti-capitalist, and how willing everyone is to just accept that of course this is a fair deal, when it's so readily apparent that it's in no way fair. None of this was subtle, and it really hit hard on the reread for me. But there's one more thing I can't not talk about, and that's Shirley. I was taken off guard again by the presumably accidental transphobic trope in this book. I discussed in my last series of Unfortunate Events review that there's the hench person of indeterminate gender, and how they are not really always handled well in the series. And this one features Olaf dressing up as a woman to prey on children. And it's very clear that Olaf is not trans. He never expresses any real connection to the character he's playing any more than any of the rest of the characters he plays. He does not express any dysphoria or euphoria. He doesn't even ever say anything about really feeling like a woman. I would bet my last dollar that the author in no way intended Olaf to be read as trans in this book. But then there's the scene where Violet is calling him Olaf, and he's talking about how it's only polite to refer to him by his chosen name, and pointed to his name tag as proof he's Shirley, because, you know, he has a name tag. He's changed his name. That means he is who he says he is. And it's meant to be ridiculous, because this is clearly Olaf, and the gag throughout the entire fucking series is that no one can recognize Olaf when it's incredibly clear it's Olaf. He's playing a part. He's in disguise. But the problem with all that is how a lot of people actually think trans people are. Someone just putting on a role for nefarious purposes. To say its appearance in this book is problematic would be an understatement. Now, do I think the author is transphobic? No. This was written in a time when the conversation around trans people was just not as present in the public eye. He likely wasn't thinking about trans people at all when he had Olaf put on a dress and call himself Shirley. But it's impossible not to see it now if you are at all aware of trans people and the way they are treated in the current culture. And so, meant or not, this felt like an attempted confirmation of the misguided idea that trans people are just playing a role and are dangerous. And that's not a good message to be sending right now, especially to children. And it's just sad because there's so much in the story of the Baudelaires that I feel would resonate with trans people. The trans folks I've known are just like the Baudelaires, trying to live their lives, not bother anyone, and go about their business in a world that seems set up to make it as difficult and dangerous as possible. They are often met with people who refuse to listen to their personal experiences, like the Baudelaires constantly being dismissed when they try to tell the adults around them about Count Olaf. The Baudelaires are at the mercy of a society that, even when well-meaning, often fails to protect them, and when they try to protect themselves, they are reprimanded. The Baudelaires have a group of people actively trying to hunt and control them who just seem to hate them for no reason. And hell, the Baudelaires are also consistently misnamed. Olaf insists on calling them orphans throughout the entire series rather than any actual names, and he often resorts to petty name-calling whenever they don't do what he wants them to. And in this book in particular, there's a foreman character who calls them all sorts of names that are not their own. And not necessarily offensive names, but just not their names. And he also consistently calls them a derogatory term for short people, no matter how many times they tell him they are children. The Baudelaires are often left fighting for the right to just exist, and fighting either alone or alongside allies, equally powerless. And almost no one accepts how dangerous of a situation they are in. A lot of this has to feel familiar to trans readers. Also, yeah, there are just a few what I'm going to call outdated terms in this book. But then again, the book is 20 years old. Books, like all art, age. And not every scene, every sentence, every word is going to age well. Does that mean you aren't allowed to be offended? Of course not. Your feelings are valid. Does that mean you should throw the baby out with the bathwater and just stop reading older books? I mean, that is sort of up to you, and personally I think each book should be judged on its own merits, but it is important to be aware of these things, especially when they appear in childhood favorites, because those are the books that wheedle their way into your soul and completely change who you are as a human being. There are books that I read when I was like 10 that still contribute to the way I see the world. So overall, I walked away from this one with really mixed feelings. I would say it's one of my least favorites of this series, but I still overall love the series. I love the voice of these books. The dry, direct, overly serious way of telling the story is a delicious counterpoint to the ridiculousness of the story. The fact that the series is at its core one that presents knowledge, creativity, and special interests as the only power that ever seems to improve the world, and the steadfast desire to improve the world. There's a moment in this one where the kids are feeling that very specific despair of knowing they may have to live years in this joyless existence with little to no changes, and they briefly discuss what they will do when they gain access to their fortunes. Which, yes, even though this is a series that is built around the fact that these kids stand to inherit a fortune, the actual money and what it could mean is very rarely touched on. But here, the kids dream of what they could do with that money. Violet wants to have an inventing laboratory where Aunt Josephine lived, to remember her. Klaus wants to open a public library and buy back Uncle Monty's reptile collection. And Sunny wants to be a dentist. All of these are dreams of service for others, helping others, remembering their loved ones, and making the world a better place. And in the end, that's why, even at its most melancholy, this series is, in the end, hopeful. It is about making the world a better place in the face of terrible odds. So yeah, it is somehow still vaguely cheerful.